Hello. Did you know that God's will is Neapolitan, that God's will comes in 3 flavors? I'm Dr. Rick Durst. I teach theology at Golden Gate Baptist Theological Seminary. And this little talk is about 3 dimensions of God's will. And if you understand these 3 dimensions, you will be able to have a better understanding of how life really works. Romans chapter 12. Verse 2 says, "Do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is good, pleasing, and perfect will of God." Let me talk about these 3 dimensions. The first dimension is the sovereign will of God. Inside this circle is everything that happens. Anything that doesn't happen is outside this circle, that God has a yes and no over everything. Here's His no, it doesn't happen. Everything else God at least permits. Sometimes theologians will talk about God's permissive will. Calvin said everything is directed by God's will, so he wasn't in favor of the idea of permissive will. But most theologians make a space for that, that God permits things to happen and causes things to happen. All of those are within His sovereign will. A bit more narrow than that is God's moral will. And God has expressed what is pleasing to Him. Generally, we think about this in terms of the commandments or the Sermon on the Mount, where God makes clear what is pleasing to Him and what is unpleasing to Him. So it's possible, if you understand this model correctly, to say something can be outside God's moral will while it's still inside God's sovereign will. God does let us sin. God does let us act foolishly. But sometimes when we intend to sin, God makes a way of escape so it doesn't happen. And He keeps us inside His moral will. The third dimension of that is individual will. This passage seems to be talking about God's perfect and individual will. And so I'll put the word individual here. Because we certainly want to walk in God's will together. In Micah it says, "What does God want of you after all? But to walk with God humbly and to do kindness and to love justice." Now Gary Friesen in his book Decision Making and the Will of God makes a suggestion that based on this model that perhaps God leaves decisions as long as they are within His moral will as informed by Scripture, that anything within God's moral will is pleasing to God, and so there's no definite domain of individual will, as opposed to others who look at God's individual will for us as if it's a dot, and it's very easy to miss. Others have suggested God's individual is much broader, and I think that your worldview can be determined by the size of what you think this individual will component is. Now, in the next video, I'm going to take a different perspective of knowing God's will with reference to how to walk in wisdom. I want to use an expanded version of Gary Friesen's model in talking about 7 aspects of knowing and walking in God's will. Thanks for watching. Hope you watch the next video too.